All right, at least one more of these for now, for today. I'm trying to do a lot. Let's take a look at one of everybody's favorites, Tetris, right? This one would kind of scare the hell out of me, to be honest, because, all right, let's just go ahead and draw on our board, right? Because I have a bad feeling I would want to go physics heavy on this, or at least partially, okay? Meaning I would use so let's say here's a shape, right? Okay, so your typical kind of L shape. For each one of these squares, let's kind of call them cells in here. I have a feeling I would go with an actual physics body. All right. So once you've done, got a few of these in here, and you've got little parts sticking up like this and like this. I feel like I would end up relying somewhat on those physics bodies to stop collisions, for example. So this guy, right? Let's suppose there's another block there. So he would fit into there, correct? Right? Um, which, is a little good and bad at times. One thing, even if I was using physics bodies to detect, okay, you can't go further down here, whatever, this is stopping you. I would make sure, well, for one, that these shapes are only ever moving lined up with the particular columns that they could go into, right? So at no point would you ever have a situation like this where this L shape is coming down and it's gonna kind of come into the wrong place over here. So I would try to trap these into very specific locations on the y-axis, right? Which makes sense anyway. I mean, every Tetris game is like that, so you don't expect a smooth motion as you're going back and forth across the screen. It's always bump, 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 like that, right? Now, so the issue with the physics is, I don't know. That's the problem. Is I don't see a big problem with it right away. But well, I guess time would tell on that one, right? Things to consider would be that as these things are coming down, right? You've got all your various little shapes here. This is one, right? You got your good old long pipe. Everyone likes that one. I think the tendency would be to kind of have these as one unit, but I would not do that. I would certainly not with the artwork. I would actually use, so for example, this would be 4 cells, and you just kind of keep them together. Obviously, at some point you're gonna rotate these, right? So you'd have to figure out, okay, well, when I do rotate them, we got to keep these guys together. That's not the hardest thing in the world. And you could actually have a kind of parent cell for these, or parent class that initially keeps them together. Point though, with breaking them up into their individual cells, is that at some point you have to break them up, right? So for example, this 4-piece lands, well, here, let's say it finishes off a slot down here. This was empty before, right? Well, this one, when this whole line gets removed, you got to get rid of that one anyway, right? So at some point you are breaking all of these up back down into their cell shapes. So it's really just that point in the beginning of the game when these guys start coming down here that you need to keep them together. So, in terms of, how do we figure out, a line across here? It's similar to when we were talking about the chess pieces earlier. I mean, you could certainly do something like that where you basically just start defining A, B, C, things like that, and then this is 1, 2, 3, and so on, and you could initially spawn very easily the entire board game, or basically the entire scene, with as many rows and columns as you need, and you could have an invisible little area right here. So let's say that, again, getting back to physics contacts, but you could just basically have a contact point. Okay, now it's a physics body Perhaps actually, if your square is that big, maybe even just your kind of physics contact is a bit smaller than it. Okay, so it's just taking up this little tiny spot, right? Basically, right at the center of it, and this is what's used to basically kind of trigger on or off. Is this spot occupied? So when one of these guys lands in there, it takes up this entire space, right? So I'll just pretend that's taking up the entire space. Then at that point, well, then A12 is, on, has something on it, right? And then, logic-wise, of course, when something drops, then you're basically, you're almost always looking to see if, all of A has been occupied, And so this would be, obviously, its own class. You're kind of basically your contact for each one of these guys. Your cell, the cell, whatever we're going to call that, that's going to be its own little class, having its little properties. And yeah, I think in a perfect world, these would, leaving the physics bodies on for these, right, would at least give them a chance to kind of all drop, right? When you remove, let's say you remove all this, okay, so all this stuff is going to have to go down, all right? Or what you do is you just shift everybody down X amount or Y amount. That's another option. The thing to watch out for is that, like, okay, you don't want, if you did actually have a physics body for this thing, you don't want a situation where suddenly it starts going off like this, when it drops, it goes like that. Now, everything should, in theory, just drop right down, right? And what you could do is you could also periodically, turn basically the dynamic property for these, if you're using SpriteKit, on or off. Okay, so, when there's no, wiping out of an entire row going on, then they're all just kind of locked. They can't move or anything like that. And you could also go and say, okay, well, if you, for example, this guy right here, if you're touching spot or the contact point for, C3, okay, well, we could use that as a Oh, well, there you go. Someone's calling. Well, that's a spam phone call anyway. So take that. Now your number's on the video. You could also be sure that these are always locked at a particular position, So, for example, well, obviously just wherever the contact was for C3, just make sure it's always locked in there. But then, so anyway, once you wipe out a row, then you could switch the dynamic property, dynamic is going to be, and affected by gravity, it's going to temporarily be back on again, and then you turn it right back off after whatever, as soon as it's kind of landed back down. So, yeah. And then in terms of, your usual game loop, I've kind of enjoyed drawing a loop. Looping arrows. You've got a timer that's just putting blocks down here, and you could always set up some sort of way for people to see what the next block is it's going to be. So you're always kind of picking out ahead of time a block. Then speed, obviously that's an easy one. So you basically just have a kind of universal speed for all of these guys that they're gonna descend downward. In terms of the how are you rotating them, how are you moving them around? Oh, well, there's some. I would probably just do tap to rotate, and then you could obviously do some sort of swipe for going left or right. You could also let's see, for swiping. Yeah, I guess that kind of makes sense for going over one at a time. Maybe you could do kind of longer swipes. Detect how far people swipe to send one over. Like really far to the edge. That's one of those things I think you basically just got to be sitting down with and kind of playing the game. I did not actually. I don't think I've ever downloaded a Tetris game for the iPhone. So. maybe that's how it's done. Maybe that's there's probably 1,000 of them. But anyway, that's again, we've scribbled out some sort of crazy this on these pieces of paper. I actually like what's going on right here. In fact, you know what, if I was gonna do a Tetris game, well, first off, legally you probably have to make it very different anyway. But this would be the most fun aspect, is that every once in a while you could just, one of these would just fall into a different spot. It would be like a, you know, like bad Tetris. So let's write that over there. That's the note. Bad Tetris. All right, I'm gonna do one more today. Next video I'm gonna do. What am I doing? Gallica, something like that. We'll see how that goes.